This winter lecture series is sponsored by the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church and we partner with OLLI, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, who help us to spread the word about with needed publicity and so forth. The program is funded in part by Humanities Nebraska and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. This year we have, as you know, 6 lectures. Tonight's lecturer is Ambassador Christopher Hill. The lecture after this one, the 4th one, next Sunday, March 3rd, will be Professor Nan Kim of the History Department of University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her topic is somewhat different from the one that was in the written announcements previously. Her title is Meeting with the Past, Summit Diplomacy, Reunions of Long-Separated Families, and Intimate Legacies of War and Division in Korea. All the lectures, including tonight's, will be available on the Unitarian Church website, and that is unitarianlincoln.org. You all know about what to look for bad weather. I won't repeat that. We've had some experience with that. David Forsyth just said everyone who's here ought to have a gold star. I certainly agree with that. Especially that's true of our speakers, of Christopher Hill and his wife Julie, who started off yesterday they had breakfast at the Denver airport yesterday and waited for their plane to finally depart, and it didn't, after, of course, being delayed. The usual pattern of first a delay and then a cancellation. And so they made arrangements to come today, and we're taking the same flight, which should have landed around 2:30 this afternoon in Lincoln, and that's roughly about when they took off from Denver this time. So as for heroic gold stars to be awarded, yes. And when I mentioned on the phone to Christopher Hill today that he had a rough time, his comment was, yes, but it's a beautiful sunny day in Lincoln. So, you know the rhythm of our activities, the lecture for up to 60 minutes, a break for 15 minutes, and back here for Q&A. Today I'm going to introduce formally now Christopher Robert Hill. He is currently the Chief Advisor to the Chancellor for Global Engagement and Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy at the University of Denver. Prior to this position, he was the Dean of the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at Denver University. He is author of Outpost, Life on the Frontiers of American Diplomacy, a memoir. And he currently is a regular columnist for Project Syndicate. As a former career diplomat, Ambassador Hill served 4 times as ambassador to various places, nominated in those roles by 3 different presidents. His most recent post was ambassador to Iraq. And in the State Department, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Most relevant to our series, after he served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea, he headed the U.S. delegation to the 6-party talks on the North Korean nuclear issue. Other posts have included Ambassador to Poland, Ambassador to the Republic of Macedonia, and Special Envoy to Kosovo. From 1999 to 2000, he served as a special assistant to the president and senior director on the staff of the National Security Council. After various other roles in the State Department, Ambassador Hill received the State Department's Distinguished Service Award for his contributions as a member of the U.S. negotiating team in the Bosnia peace settlement, and he was a recipient of the Robert S. Fraser Award for Peace Negotiations for his work on the Kosovo crisis. Ambassador Hill graduated from Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, with a BA in economics. He received a master's degree from the Naval War College in 1994. I didn't write down master's in what? in national security. Served in the Peace Corps and speaks Polish, Serbo-Croatian, and Macedonian. Now that we are a couple days away from the summit on Korean nuclear disarmament, it seems awfully appropriate for us to welcome Ambassador Christopher Hill.
Thank you very much, Dick, for those very kind comments. And thank you for mentioning some of the other places I served, because in one place I always have this inspiring speech to recall when I consider North Korea, and that is in Poland, which used to be a communist country until 1989. They had a Communist Party first secretary named Władysław Gomułka, name otherwise lost to history. And Władysław Gomułka, he was the party first secretary in the late 50s, early 60s. And he was known for very long speeches and not very successful metaphors. And one day he stood up in front of a large crowd in the southern Polish city of Kraków, and he said, "Comrades, just a few years ago, our fatherland stood on the very edge of a deep abyss. And I'm here to tell you today, comrades, that we have taken an important step forward." So, as we consider the immortal words of Władysław Gomułka taking that important step forward, it is a good time to reflect on, what are we doing on North Korea? And frankly, what are the prospects of dealing with this problem? North Korea, as I understand from Dick, and you've gone up to the Korean War in these lectures, and I wish I could tell you that it gets a lot better from there, but actually it's been quite a difficult struggle. North Korea is a country with about 22.8 million people, about one-third or one-half the size of South Korea, which is about 48 million or so. North Korea, until 1960 actually, had a much higher per capita income than South Korea. And as late as 1972, South Korea's three leading exports consisted of textiles, plywood. They would import the wood, import the glue, and make plywood. That was export number 2. And export number 3 was human hair wigs. So South Korea was, not such an advanced country in 1972, and North Korea was still pretty much at par with South Korea. And then, of course, we all know what's called the Miracle on the Han River, this just extraordinary country. And those of you who served in Korea, maybe who have relatives who served in the Korean War, many Americans thought of it as the forgotten war, the first war where, the outcome was kind of not what we wanted it to be. But I think anyone who's lived in Korea, who's gone to South Korea and seen this extraordinary country that's been created there, can feel very proud of any service and anyone they knew who had service in the Korean War, because it prevented what would have been quite a different outcome. North Korea, frankly, never reconciled themselves to the fact that their attack on June 25th, 1950, was ultimately a failure. You recall MacArthur, we were retreated way down to the Pusan perimeter, and it wasn't until 3 months later that we launched attacks out of the Pusan perimeter, the southern Korean city of Pusan, and also famously launched the attack in Incheon. Today, when we talk about Incheon landings, you're thinking of something that happens every 12 seconds at Incheon Airport. But of course, in those days, Incheon landing meant one thing. So the North Koreans never reconcile themselves to this horrendous defeat, and have always maintained in their view of the peninsula affairs that they need to unify the country. And this, I think, is important, because this leads to their desire to develop a nuclear program as early as the 1960s. The nuclear program, they got help from the Soviet Union. They asked, the North Koreans, I guess they're of the view that there's no harm in asking, so they asked for some nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev said, and later Brezhnev said, no, we're not going to do that, but they did help them with an experimental reactor. So the North Koreans took this experimental reactor and essentially experimented with a technology which is plutonium based, and I do need to spend about 30 seconds on this issue of the science. So they have a reactor in a place called Yongbyon, not to be confused with Yongpyong, which is a South Korean ski resort. But Yongbyon is a nuclear facility. I've been there. It sort of looks like sort of an old Romanian textile factory, except they're producing spent fuel rods that come out of the reactor, and the spent fuel rods go into a so-called plutonium reprocessing facility. And through this reprocessing, they get these things which are called pucks, and they look kind of like hockey pucks. And that is plutonium fuel that is used, that is weapons grade and used in a warhead and used to create a fissile reaction and a nuclear explosion. So they've been at this for quite a while. During the Clinton years in the 1990s, the U.S. government, increasingly concerned about signs that they were going nuclear, entered into a negotiation and came up with a following kind of proposal or design of the negotiations. North Korea would shut down their reactor, would stop producing this fissile material, this plutonium. In return, the Clinton administration, working with other countries, would provide to North Korea two what are called light water reactors. These are reactors with a different technology whose byproduct is not weapons-grade plutonium. It's very difficult to turn the spent fuel of a light water reactor into a weapons-grade material. So the idea was to kind of buy into the North Korean notion that they needed nuclear material since they don't have oil, they have coal, but very cheap form of coal. They don't really have any natural resources for fuel. So it was to buy into the idea they needed some kind of means for electricity. The trouble was, as the program went forward in the kind of mid to late 1990s, the Clinton administration, toward the end of that time, started noticing that there were some imports of various equipment which was consistent with the other way of making a bomb. That is, you've all heard about the Iranian nuclear program, and it was not based on plutonium, although there are signs that the Iranians had followed that as well. But the other way is to have centrifuges, which are about 8 feet high, about this much in circumference, and they spin it's a very tough thing to do, but ultimately the purpose of a centrifuge in spinning is to take enriched uranium and enrich it to so-called 90%, which is weapons-grade uranium. Now, you might say, well, if they've already produced plutonium, and by the way, we have a pretty good idea of how much plutonium they've produced. I mean, we could watch that reactor from satellites. We knew when it was on, we knew when it was off. We had a pretty clear idea of what they had actually produced in terms of plutonium. And in fact, later on, which I'll get to, when we were able to get the records from the reactor and study the records, sure enough, what they showed us in terms of what they produced was consistent with what we thought they had produced, because we could look at it from outer space. The trouble with uranium enrichment is you can put 200 of these centrifuges in a room this size, and provided you have a very good electricity, very constant electricity source, which you can imagine is a problem in North Korea, you are able to produce highly enriched uranium, and it's very hard to see. You can produce it underground. And our ability to know whether they're producing uranium enrichment's very tough. Unlike, looking at a reactor and seeing it belch out steam, et cetera, you might be able to look at the electricity grid in a certain way, in a certain area, and you might say, well, wait a minute, what's the big draw on this electricity today? Why is the electricity being drawn on so much? Are they watching Nebraska football that day? I mean, what is it? And what it was, of course, was, you can get some sense of whether they have a centrifuge field, which takes a lot of electricity. But as my point is, it's very hard to discern. So the Clinton administration saw that this was going on, and in 1999, they basically made a decision, which is, this is bad. This has got to be followed up on. We got to find out if they're doing this. But let's keep our eye on the prize. Let's keep our eye on the plutonium that we know is being produced. We know has been a big problem. So let's try to make sure that is finally shut down. So the Bush administration came in, and I would say it was more of a philosophical difference. And it was basically the idea, they're lying to us. And if they're going to lie to us, we're not going to deal with them. And if we're not going to deal with them, we're going to cut off all these negotiations. We're not giving them light water reactors. We're not even going to talk to them. And that's that. So the North Koreans said, fine, we'll kick out the inspectors. And part of the Clinton deal was to get international inspectors to be around the plutonium plant, make sure not only that it was off, but also you learn a lot by being on the ground rather than being, a couple of hundred miles in outer space. So all that was gone, and then suddenly North Korea in 2001, 2002 started producing a lot more plutonium. So at this point, in about 2004, 2003, 2004, the Chinese got very alarmed by the fact that the North Koreans looked like they were a threshold nuclear state. So the Chinese were concerned. China is a work in progress right now. We have a lot of issues with China. But at that time, in 2003, 2004, they became very concerned that North Korea could actually have a nuclear breakout. And Jiang Zemin, the Chinese leader, went to Crawford, Texas, and met with George W. Bush. And they had a conversation about what to do about it. And George W. Bush said, we're not going to deal with them anymore. They lied to us. My predecessor, Bill Clinton, had a deal, and they lied to him, and we're not going to deal with them. And so the Chinese, taking a somewhat different approach to that, said, Mr. President, how about if we have a group of countries, not just the U.S., but we would be involved, all the neighbors, China, all the neighbors in addition to China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, all of them would be involved in something we would call the six-party talks, and we, China, will host this, and we will, five of us will gang up on the North Koreans and try to come up with some type of arrangement. So the President Bush, already having a tough situation, because this was about the time, the Afghanistan war had started, and about the time we were going into Iraq. He said, okay, we will work with you on this. So at that point, President Bush, as he got into his second term, started the negotiations in earnest, and he asked, I had been ambassador in South Korea, and I had seen the problem that our failing to negotiate, our failing to work with the North Koreans was causing big problems in South Korea. The South Koreans would say things like, easy for you living in Washington to say you won't deal with them. We can, how to put it, see North Korea from our bedroom window. And for us, this is very real, kind of my words, but their thoughts. And come on, America, you're our ally. We need to work together on this. So after this meeting with the Chinese, the president agreed to do just that. I was very aware of it because I was living in Korea and seeing our 50-year alliance with the Koreans starting to, need a little marriage counseling. So I realized there was a problem, and so when Secretary Rice asked me to come back and be the Assistant Secretary for Asia and take on the negotiating with North Korea, I asked her one question. I said, I know the president doesn't want to talk to those people, but the negotiator has to talk to the North Koreans. And at first she said, absolutely, as long as the Chinese are in the room. I said, I don't know if we can always have the Chinese in the room, but we need to think of the 6 parties as a sort of platform where we can talk to the North Koreans bilaterally, the South Koreans can talk to them bilaterally, the Chinese can talk to the South Koreans can talk to the Japanese. It's a great platform for doing different things. Japan has had some real problems with Korea over the years, and many of you may have heard something called the abduction issue, where literally, North Korean commandos pull Japanese off of their streets and put them to work either teaching Japanese to their spies and things like that. I mean, it was pretty horrific. The North Koreans finally admitted it to the Japanese, but in producing the death certificates of several of those people, of these Japanese who had died, they didn't make a very convincing case, and so the Japanese had a real problem talking with the North Koreans, but not within a 6-party thing. We could get stuff done in a 6-party meeting. We worked very hard, and by September 19th, 2005, we were able to get an agreement wherein North Korea agreed to give up, to abandon all its nuclear programs, abandon its nuclear weapons, return to the Non-Proliferation Treaty at an early date. That was very important because the Non-Proliferation Treaty, if you're in the treaty, there are only 5 nuclear states and North Korea is not one of them. So their commitment to return was very important. They agreed to shut down the reactor, which they did. They agreed to put in international inspectors again, and they did something more than they had done earlier. They agreed to start disabling the reactor so it wasn't easy to put back together, including blowing up the cooling tower and doing some other steps that made the reactor, essentially, it has not worked since the time we got that done. So as we moved into 2008, and you might say, well, wait a minute, 2005, 2008, believe me, it's slow going, it's tough going. But what was interesting, of course, is there were so many people back in the administration who hated the idea of talking to the North Koreans. There was one gentleman named John Bolton who, when you're a negotiator, you essentially write your own instructions, so that there'll be a telegram from the State Department to, in this case, Embassy Beijing, because we had the negotiations in Beijing. And and it would say, instructions for Ambassador Hill. Now, my staff would write about 90% of it, but then these instructions that I would be very aware of when I got to Beijing and I got my instruction telegram, I knew exactly what was in it. But, you had to give them around to the bureaucracy, so everyone kind of felt that they were making a contribution. So the then head of non-proliferation, John Bolton, would put stuff in there like no toasting with the North Koreans at any banquet. So if anyone who's been to a Chinese banquet and knows that they toast on average about 90 seconds, every 90 seconds, the American negotiator was supposed to sit there with his hands folded, scowling, I guess, at the North Koreans while everyone toasted to the success of the negotiations. That kind of stuff was not terribly helpful. I remember going in to see Secretary Rice, and I said, so you want me to go in there and not even shake it? Another thing was I couldn't shake their hand. I said, you really want me to go in there? She said, just ignore that stuff. Don't worry about that stuff. So parenthetically, you have to wonder what's going on right now and whether this could have really happened if John Bolton were still alive, but that's another matter. So we worked very hard on getting this stuff done. It was a slog, and you felt that as many people were opposed to what you're doing back in Washington as there were people, supporting what you're doing. But I can tell you the South Koreans really appreciated our engagement, and we were able to establish some patterns of cooperation with the Chinese, which I think is was necessary then and necessary now. So along comes 2008, and suddenly the North Koreans are not giving us enough in terms of what we need in terms of something called verification protocol. So what does that mean? So the North Koreans gave us a long list of their nuclear programs. Interesting stuff, actually. A lot of stuff that we didn't know. But we could not find from the North Koreans what they had done with some of this specialized aluminum, which we knew were casings of centrifuges. So at one point, the North Koreans said, oh, no, that had nothing to do with centrifuges. And I said, well, what was it for? Oh, it was for a special ship maritime armament. I said, really? Could we have a look at it? And lo and behold, they let us go into a factory. And our people were able to get some samples of it, which, by the way, couldn't have been done if we didn't have a diplomatic process. They never would have shown that. And so my deputy carried it back to Washington and gave it to some specialized agencies who said, no, this is not for a maritime gun. This is for a centrifuge. So we learned a lot, but they were still not acknowledging what they're doing. I had the view that, okay, the declaration isn't complete, but there's a lot of stuff on it. The real question now is the verification protocol. And here we were also not getting what we needed to do. So you could see on this list, you could see that they explained they had some facility for some engine testing. And so if it was on the list, you're allowed to go see the engine testing facility. But if you had suspicions of what might be going on in a certain place and it wasn't on the list, you weren't supposed to be able to see it. So I told the North Koreans, this is not going to work. At this time, by the way, North Korea, this was in the late summer, beginning of fall of 2008, they weren't as quick with the answers. And then we found out that Kim Jong-il had become Kim Jong very ill in the summer of 2008. And clearly he was not, the interlocutor. It was a combination of military people, et cetera. It wasn't working. In a perfect world, there would have been a justification to say, look, let's take what they've given us. Let's go and start a verification protocol based on the list they've got. We know it's incomplete, but we'll probably find out more stuff about them that we knew before, and perhaps we can expand the scope of activities such that at some point we'll be able to see things that are not even on the list, and we'll learn a lot more. So in a perfect world, the negotiator should have said that to the Secretary of State, that let's just take what we've got and see what we can get further out of this. But it wasn't a perfect world, and to have gone back to Washington and say, well, they didn't really tell us about uranium enrichment, and the verification protocol is not what we need. So we talked it over, and we said, okay, over to you, Obama administration. At this point, I talked to the incoming secretary, Secretary Clinton, about it, and she had this thought that they could really go in there moving. But it was pretty clear that the administration felt they were going to take so much grief from people like John Bolton for anything they tried to do, and they could see that the North Koreans were clearly pulling back. One theory was they were pulling back because they were waiting for the new administration, but when the new administration came back, and they were still pulling back, so it was clear they were not ready to go further on this. So the Obama administration essentially didn't push the envelope in terms of getting into negotiations. They worked with the Chinese. They did a lot of good work in terms of cyber attacks on some of North Korea's weapons programs. That's risky, tough stuff, and they did it, and I give them a lot of credit for that. But essentially, they turned it all over to the current administration. So the current administration takes up this issue and realizes it's worse than it ever was before. North Korea had brought out several new generations of missiles. They brought out a new multi-stage missile, the Hwasong-14, which is believed to have the capacity to hit the continental U.S. They also, importantly, brought out a new generation of missiles that were so-called solid fuel. The difference between solid fuel and liquid fuel, Liquid fuel, you stand up the missile, you attach a garden hose to it, you wait 5 hours, and then we can look at it and say, should we hit that thing on the launch pad, or what should we do? So you got a lot of time to think about it. 5 hours is a lot of time. But if it's a solid fuel missile, it can be erected right in the middle of a forest with a missile launcher, and within seconds it's in the air. They also perfected, or at least experimented with, missiles that could be launched out of a North Korean submarine. I wouldn't want to be on board that submarine when that happens, but that's so they had made a lot of step forward, lots of steps forward in the missile program. Meanwhile, during my time, generally speaking, when you're in a negotiation with them, they don't test. So I know the president is very excited about the fact that they haven't tested since Singapore. In fact, they don't test when you're in a negotiation. When we were not in a negotiation for about 18 months, back in 06 and during calendar year 06 and a couple of months in 07, they did test a nuclear explosion. It was a fizzle. It didn't work. And they tested a few rockets. But generally, they don't test if you're talking to them. And so starting with the Obama administration and continuing with the Trump administration, they had 5 very successful tests, including the most recent one, which was a hydrogen test. So they clearly had made a lot of progress. In 2017, of course, the president reacted to this with a very sort of bellicose, my button is bigger than your button, and, little rocket man will, rue the day he was born, and this kind of stuff. Well, that's just throwing Brer Rabbit in the briar patch. I mean, the North Koreans love that kind of stuff, and they had a blast returning it in kind. But meanwhile, the Trump administration had been very successful in the UN, working with China in the UN. Remember, this is before all the tariff stuff, in terms of getting the Chinese to go along with much stricter sanctions. So by November, around that time, we had, for the first time, the Chinese agreed they're going to prevent gasoline sales to North Korea. That is clearly what got their attention. So when we get to, we get through December, a lot of tough words going on between our president and their leadership. I mean, most Americans who had sort of contemplated surviving, having their relatives over for the holidays, were now thinking about how to survive a nuclear war. Julie and I have a friend who was playing golf in Hawaii, and literally his phone went off with a warning about incoming North Korean missiles. And it was his best game ever, so he stayed out there. But so it was getting kind of hairy. And then Kim Jong-un gets up on January 1st, and he says the sort of the usual stuff, the usual kind of hardline North Korean stuff. First of all, he talks about how steel production is up, and potato production is up, and typical sort of communist New Year's speech. But then he mentioned that South Korea was having an Olympics, and he wished them well. And the South Koreans, who monitor this stuff very carefully, I mean, at first I thought, I was looking at the translation, and I thought, oh, this is one of those, well, nice Olympics. It would be a shame if something happened to them. But it was actually apparently much more sincere than that. And then, so the South Koreans, worried about the fate of those Olympics and worried about a lot of things, especially what was going on in Washington, sent a team up to Pyongyang to explore whether there's something new from the North Koreans. And so sure enough, the North Koreans said, Kim Jong-un, he met with his team, and he said, yes, we would, first of all, we'd like to participate in the Olympics. And they worked out a deal. It was a little ham-handed. I mean, the South Koreans kicked several women off their women's hockey team and replaced those slots with North Korean women hockey players. And I remember the South Korean prime minister, who I can't believe is a politician, said, they were going to lose anyway. So, but anyway, there were a few problems in how they integrated the North Koreans into the Korean Olympic team, but generally it went pretty well. And then Kim Jong-un said something that every North Korean, or I should say his father and his grandfathers have said before. In talking to the South Koreans, he said, I would like to meet with the American president. This, I remember Kim Jong-il said that about Clinton. He said that about George W. Bush. I never heard Clinton's reaction, but I did hear Bush's reaction, which was no thank you. And so this was not something new, but the South Koreans said, all right, we'll convey this to Washington. So whereupon director of the South Korean intelligence service, a guy named Suh, Director Suh, who was leading the delegation in Pyongyang, came back to Seoul, reported to his president, Moon Jae-in, who was trying to kind of push the envelope here. And it was Moon Jae-in who, by the way, later on said, if this all works, President Trump deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. The trouble was President Trump thought it was Abe who said that, what with him looking a little like Moon. And then then Abe didn't want to say, no, I didn't, but he couldn't really say, yes, I did, so he just said, no comment. I'm sorry, that's an aside. But Director Suh and his colleagues went to Washington, and they went to McMaster's office, the then National Security Advisor, and they began to lay out what the conversation was. And at that point, President came into McMaster's office and said, because he knew what they were coming there for, and he said, why don't you come over to the Oval Office? Well, Koreans have believe me, a great sense of protocol. And so Director Suh was just mortified at the idea he was going to be sitting, at the wing chair next to the fireplace in the Oval Office, but he did it. And he laid out the invitation. So usually, and again, I confess I'm kind of a grizzled Foreign Service officer, but the way I like to see those things be handled is I would have liked to see our president say, thank you very much for this invitation. I appreciate your coming all this way to convey this. It's very important. It's really quite a matter of national security. I'd like to talk this over with my staff, and we will get back to you as soon as we can on how we manage that. Instead, he said, sure, I'll do it. So, and then, again, I mean, this is the grouchy Foreign Service officer in me. I like to see a White House spokesperson go out to the lawn and say the president has agreed to meet with the North Korean leader with a time to be determined. Instead, they had the Korean CIA guy, Director Suh, go out there and make the announcement on behalf of the U.S. and I guess on behalf of the North Koreans. So, there are reasons for procedures, as we all tell our children. And, we went way off the rails with this one. So at that point, then the question became, how is this all going to work? Well, you recall the great cliffhanger. Where's it going to be? Is it going to be Ulaanbaatar? And Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, didn't really sing in people's minds. So it ends up in Singapore. So normally, and I'm of the view that normally is a good word, and normal is a very good thing, and we should all strive for it in our lives. Normally, you would send a team, and they would sit down, they would meet with the other leader's team, and I've been on these things, and you usually sit down and say, we're very pleased that our president and your leader are going to have a meeting. This is very important for both our countries, for our relationship, and we want this to be very successful. So we are here to propose to you, we have a draft joint statement. This is something we've done. We realize you'll have some elements, and you may disagree with many of our elements, but if you can take a look at this, we have plenty of time. We look forward to getting your response to this, but we want to see if we can agree on a draft on a statement that the two presidents will be able to announce. So the purpose of that, whenever you hear about some summit meeting going on and they say, will it happen or will it not happen? Believe me, normally the conclusion is already done. They can sit there and talk about whatever they want because we've already got the agreed statement. I mean, if they want to sit there and talk about each other's haircut, that's fine. It doesn't matter because it's already agreed. In this case, there was very little agreement on what this thing would look like. As we got kind of closer, you recall there were a few hiccups. You recall a few weeks before the National Security Advisor, the person who replaced McMaster, about a month after McMaster had hosted the Koreans, that is John Bolton, he said the North Koreans should just accept the Libya model. By the Libya model, he was referring to the fact that back in 2001, 2002, Gaddafi, there were some very secret meetings in London between Gaddafi on one hand and the US and British diplomats on the other. And we essentially took equipment that he had purchased in anticipation of maybe putting together a nuclear program, and we bought it all back from him. And there was basically no strings attached. So that's what John Bolton meant by the Libya model. But of course, in the meantime, a few things have happened in Libya, such as Gaddafi's state funeral. And so, this wasn't very appealing. So, in fact, when President Trump hosted the #2 North Korean, Kim Jong-chul, in the White House, you recall he came with that comically sized big envelope, which had a normal-sized letter in it. You recall, so normally in any administration I've ever heard of, you would never see the National Security Advisor more than maybe 2 feet from the president. So Stephen Hadley was always there when President Bush was meeting. Before Hadley, Rice was always there. Sandy Berger was always there when Clinton. It's always, Brent Scowcroft with Bush Sr. It was always that. John Bolton was nowhere to be found, so we were wondering whether he'd been locked in a room in the basement or something. Because the president really wanted this to happen. So we get to Singapore, and again, like my former deputy, who's now the ambassador in the Philippines, had been asked to go and talk to some of the North Koreans that we had talked to. And again, he was told, don't get into a row about what a joint statement would look like. Just see if there's anything there. There wasn't anything there. And so they meet in Singapore. And the president clearly saw this as an opportunity to kind of lay out a kind of new vision for how we might be able to work with the North Koreans. And by the way, that's not a bad idea. When you have a president doing this, the president should not be negotiating nuclear weapons. The president should be kind of, 30,000-foot type themes, such as, we can build a relationship, et cetera. So that was going on okay, but the question was, what were they then going to agree? And so at a certain point, the president is walking in this garden in Singapore with Kim Jong-un, and the journalist said, well, what's next on the program? The president said, oh, we're doing a signing. So at that point, the press had absolutely no idea what that meant. Normally, what you do is before you have let's say a signing of a joint statement at 3 o'clock. At around 2 o'clock, or maybe even 11 in the morning, depending on the news cycle, you will invite the journalists in. You will give them a copy of the joint statement. It'll say embargoed until 3:05 in the afternoon, and you say, okay, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, this is our joint statement. It'll be signed today at 3 o'clock. Let me draw your attention to paragraph 1. This is an important statement of North Korea's commitment to denuclearization. You'll note in paragraph 4. And you kind of go through it so that when 3 o'clock comes, the journalists all say in a historic meeting they achieved this success. But no one had any idea what was in it, and there was no briefing. So the president, if you were up at 3 in the morning, as I was, the president does that kind of familiar kind of chainsaw signature, and then he holds the, as he often does with things that he signs, he holds it up like that. A Japanese journalist using an iPhone 10 gets a picture of it, and so I was in New York at David Gura's desk. He was handling the sort of graveyard shift for NBC. And so within a few minutes, we had the thing thrown at us on the desk. And I started to read, at least the English part of it, to see what was actually in the agreement. And it was pretty ragged stuff, and it was pretty clear. It was done hastily and without a lot of preparation. So I take you over this excruciating detail because as we're getting ready now to go to another summit, we have a lot of work to do. First of all, the North Koreans did commit themselves to denuclearization, which is good, but they had no concept of time. It wasn't at an early date. There was no kind of concept. And when you read it in the North Korean, where it says they somehow support it, I should remember the precise term, it sort of had a concept of kind of ends of days, or you know, when the lions lie down with the lambs, we'll agree with denuclearization. By the way, in Israel, there's this kind of museum thing where they have a lion and a lamb, and I asked the museum, the curator, I said, how do you get that to happen? He said, well, we put in a new lamb every night. So, yeah. So there was no indication from the North Koreans on when they prepared to do this. But a couple of things came out in this. One, you recall, and this is coming up as well, there's a lot of talk about the idea of a peace treaty to replace the armistice that was signed in 1953. So what's going on there? Well, a peace treaty is or even a declaration of peace, which is really what they're talking about now. That's better than just an armistice, which is, after all, a sort of an elaborate signing ceremony. You recall World War I, 11th day, 11th hour, 11th month, the armistice was reached. But the peace treaty was not till 2 years later in the Treaty of Versailles. So the idea of getting it to a peace treaty is a good thing. It provides more stability. But let's start examining what's really going on there. Is it that the North Koreans are concerned that with only an armistice piece of paper, the U.S. could somehow tear that up and attack North Korea? Is that really what is that what they think might happen? Or could it be that the peace treaty would essentially declare a complete end of hostilities and may lay the predicate for the North Koreans saying to us, why do you therefore need 30,000 troops in South Korea if we have a peace treaty? What are they doing there? Pursuant of what? We have a peace treaty. So I would say watch that space, because the North Koreans may be thinking that this is now a sort of a new set of trenches that they're going to attack from, meaning that they're going to say, we have a peace treaty, you continue to have troops in South Korea, and those troops are a threat to us. And they represent your hostile policy to us. What are they doing there? The only reason they could be there is to attack us. And we have a peace treaty, so why are they there? So that is a real possibility. And our president needs to be very tough on this score. Now, I would suggest that he use, because the North Koreans bring this up all the time, why do you have those troops there? And why do they have exercises? Well, I would always tell Kim Dae-gwan, my North Korean interlocutor, I said, I do have a regret about our troops there. And I remember the note taker gets all excited, because really when you're talking to North Koreans, you talk to the note taker, because with due respect to Kim Dae-gwan, it's the note taker who carries the stuff back to the leader. And so I said, well, I do have a regret that we didn't have them in the spring of 1950. And if we had had our forces there, and if we had had exercises there, maybe we wouldn't have had this, I called it a very big misunderstanding. Well, the issue, of course, is that the North Koreans want to create a circumstance, and this, I want to really emphasize this, their interest in nuclear weapons has to do with a longer-term plan to make us feel uncomfortable about having U.S. forces in the middle of what could be a nuclear battlefield, although it never will be, and that therefore, maybe not this president, maybe not the next president or the next president after that, but at some point a president will say, why do we have our troops there? I mean, it's kind of dangerous. If we ever got in the middle of one of these pushing and shoving exercises, there might be a we could not assess at 0% the probability that North Korea would fire a missile at us. So why don't we just say, hey, South Koreans, you can handle it. That's kind of what they're heading, or what they're trying for. So what and I think a number of people are concerned about is soon, toward the end of that Singapore summit, the president actually learned to speak a little North Korean, because I've mentioned joint military exercises to you. That's our term for when the U.S. and South Koreans have exercises. And by the way, when you have U.S. troops there, they don't just sit there in the commissary. They do things with the indigenous troops there. I mean, whether they're in Spain or whether they're somewhere else. I mean, the purpose of troops is to exercise so that if some terrible thing comes up, they know every Kim and Lee in the Korean Army, and they're ready to work with them and deal with an emergency. So, these joint military exercises are very important. But our president referred to them by the North Korean name, which is provocative war games. And you recall that was about 3 or 4 a.m., I guess, a press conference. And he said, I'm going to postpone some of these provocative war games. And he said because they're expensive. Now, I would submit to you that if you think even a provocative war game is expensive, try having a look at the cost of a war. I mean, it was the fact that we, rearranged or retimed some exercises. I don't think that's going to be the end of the world on that. But then the president said, I would like to get our troops out of South Korea. And he said that in this press conference. Well, that's the stuff that the North Koreans told him. And so I think as he goes into this meeting in Hanoi, I think the North Koreans are going to work on that a little. I think they're going to say, look, we're going to get this peace treaty. You don't need your troops there. Why do you need them? It's a peace treaty. We're in love now. In fact, the president's in love with Kim Jong-un. And to paraphrase Tina Turner, I would say, what's love got to do with it? This is all about verification and all these, nasty little problems. So at a certain point in the summer after Singapore, and by the way, the North Koreans failed even to name a negotiator at that point. And later on, when Pompeo tried to visit North Korea, they did not have him meet with Kim Jong-un. And then after his very attenuated, his brief visit, they accused him of using gangster-type techniques with them. I mean, being rude to them. So this was kind of tough stuff. He called me in the summer, and Pompeo really does reach out to people. I appreciate that. I mean, you can disagree with people all you want, but when they reach out and hear what your views are, that's a good thing. And I told him, one, you need to put together a team because you're going to be coming back from North Korea empty-handed quite a lot, and that's what assistant secretaries are for, and secretaries should never come back empty-handed. Two, you're going to have to deal with some of the people who don't support this process, and I didn't say John Bolton, but I alluded to it, and I said, I understand the concept. You want everyone in the tent. Just remember, sometimes people make a mess inside the tent. It would be better if they're making a mess outside the tent. And then thirdly, I told him, I think you need to think more about the diplomatic architecture. And I mentioned this issue of withdrawing the troops, and that should have been a talking point worked out with the South Koreans where those troops are. And he said, we got it, we got that. And I said, I know it's dealing with China, it's tough dealing with China right now, but if you think working with China is difficult, try working against China. And I think we ought to figure out a way that we can somehow understand that they are not going to be content with after-action reports. They need to be in the front row and dealing with these issues. I think Pompeo is trying his best, and he's trying his best especially to realize the president's vision of this. But I think the fact of the matter is, as Secretary Pompeo and President Trump arrive in Hanoi, I think they arrive day after tomorrow, Kim Jong-un, as you know, has already boarded his train and is chugging his way all the way from Pyongyang down to Vietnam. I think they are going to have to deal with this North Korean demand that they have some kind of peace instrument to replace the armistice. I would say you need to be careful that it doesn't suggest that we're going to do something different with our U.S. troops who are there for defensive purposes, and the North Koreans know that. Secondly, the North Koreans have engaged in the last few months in these kind of random acts of denuclearization. Well, I mean, random acts of kindness are a nice thing, but when you dismantle an engine plant and you haven't explained how that fits in your overall program because you haven't laid out your overall program, it's hard to say whether that's a step forward or whether they're just shutting down an obsolete plant and bringing on 2 more modern plants. So a lot of problems in terms of North Korea making these kind of random actions and then expecting us to say, great idea, we'll now do something for you. So you've got to get a more sort of systematic look at all this. And finally, I think, you know, whether you're buying a rug or doing a denuclearization deal, you got to be careful not to appear to want the deal more than the other guy. And I think our president needs to be a little careful about, you know, goodwill gestures are nice. They are nice, but they're easily misunderstood, especially by an interlocutor like the North Koreans, who regard every goodwill gesture as a kind of act of weakness. So we have to be careful about this. My own view is that we can set up an incentive structure and a disincentive structure such that North Korea can come to the realization that they have a better future without their nuclear weapons than with their nuclear weapons. I think the president is on the right track and kind of laying out this vision of this, but it's not going to be enough. He needs to kind of keep these sanctions going. He needs to make sure we've got allies and friends who will work with us. And, you know, I think like a lot of things in life, you have to set your priorities. And we need, for example, European countries working with us on this. We need the Chinese working with us. We even need the Russians, if that's possible. So it's going to be a lot of work, and I think we have a very tough few days ahead of us. Thank you very much. Sure.
We can now take a break. Before you go, remember, don't bring cups and glasses back here, or my wife will come after you. Also, take a look, if you haven't already, at the photographs that are hanging in the room where we take a break. They're all done by John Keller, who is a magnificent photographer and the chief photographer for Ollie. And John, you should be out there to answer all the questions you'll have about these. See you back in 15 minutes. Thank you. It's very, very stimulating, interesting. You're going to have questions.
Oh, right. Yeah, Robert Ford, yeah. He was my deputy for a while in Iraq. Yeah. I see, yeah. Oh, in Vermont, yeah.